尊敬的士嘉堡约克区华商会会长陆炳东先生，尊敬的各位来宾，大家晚上好。我是加州贸易理事会的执行董事兼首席运营官高诗如。感谢陆先生邀请我和我的同事 Jeff 张参加贵规会的40周年庆典，并发表组织讲话。We've collaborated with your organization on many occasions over the decades, and I congratulate you on your 40th anniversary. I'm not quite up to 40 years in the business yet, but this is my 36th year of involvement with China. And a lot has changed over that time. Lots of ups and downs, but over those 36 years, I can definitely observe cycles. We are in a down part of the cycle now, for sure, with a turbulent geopolitical environment and solidly frozen relations between Canada and China. Below that block of ice, however, there are rivers where business will still flow, especially in sectors that are not sensitive. China is a complicated country with many issues that Canada rightfully disagrees with. A bilateral relationship with such a large country needs to encompass multiple tracks, including channels that will allow us to share why Canada sees things differently. I'm not here to talk about politics, but I spend my days working on the economic track where, believe it or not, things are not all bad. We'll go to the next slide. First, a bit about my organization. This year, CCBC turns 45 years old, and we got our start with when some Canadian business leaders looked at China in the late 70s and thought there might be some potential there. We had a particularly strong bond with Rong Yiren, who advised Deng Xiaoping on China's economic opening and founded CITIC in 1978, which was responsible for much of the initial Western investment in China. Next slide. In 1978, we were established as a registered nonprofit in Canada, and a tradition, which you can see here, of leading delegations to China and from China was established. We have long been the place for leaders and ministers to address the business community, and I know many of you in the room have been an important part of such missions and delegations. Next slide. We established our Beijing office in 1980 and Shanghai in 1994, and we are one of only 4 registered NGOs in China from Canada. And because China is a long-term game that needs to transcend administrations and parties, we have always worked with whomever is in government, and you'll see representatives from many stripes in these photos. Next slide. CCBC is a non-governmental, non-partisan, non-profit organization established by and for our members. Our members are about 300 organizations covering every sector, including companies, cultural organizations, educational institutions, and government agencies. I see many of our members in the room, like Tony Luke, whose company has been a member for more than 22 years, and newer members like Joyce Jiang of Apex Logistics and Allison Zhang of Shaw Plaza. I know I've seen Nick Huang of Seneca College, and there are many others in the room. I believe that our 2 organizations have very complementary missions. CCBC's mission is to create more and better business between Canada and China. We want to ensure that Canada continues to prosper. So the work we do is focused on ensuring that Canada benefits from its economic relationship with China. Next slide, please. Let me move now to the business environment between Canada and China. As I mentioned, it's not all bad news on the economic front, and much to everyone's surprise, given China's 2022 COVID lockdowns, our exports continued to grow last year, and they've done so at a consistent 4 to 5% pace since the big drop in 2019, which was the first year of very strained bilateral relations. The $28.7 billion in exports was less than 4% of Canada's total exports, so you can't say we're overly reliant on China as an export market. Next slide. Canada is a country that is deeply reliant on trade. In 2018, our trade to GDP ratio, a metric used to measure the importance of international trade relative to the domestic economy, stood at 66%. And this trailed only Germany among G7 countries. That ratio in the US is only 25%. We are much more dependent on trade with the world. So it's incumbent on Canada to be competitive everywhere we do business, including China. While the US may depend less on trade, it sends about double Canada's percentage of its global exports to China. The US may seek solidarity with other Western countries in challenging China, but it still does plenty of business with China. Next slide. About 18 months ago, CCBC released a report that calculated the economic value of China to Canada, where we essentially asked the question, what if everything stopped? If we stopped dealing with China, no exports, students, immigrants, tourists, no investment, what would happen? I'll highlight a few findings from that study, which was done by the China Institute at the University of Alberta. The researchers were able to estimate that the total economic impact of exporting to China was about $77 billion, which is more than double the value of those exports. These China-bound exports supported more than 365,000 jobs, jobs which have a 4.5% wage premium relative to the average Canadian job. And that amounts to $18 billion in extra wages for Canadians. But what are we exporting? You can see here that the products that dominate are commodities: wood, minerals, food, and some manufacturing. Our 22 mix was a bit different than this 2020 chart, but let's use this as an example. Those numbers are dominated by commodities, but there's amazing action around consumer products. The picture here is me in the first Tim Hortons store in Shanghai in 2019. And we'll talk about Tim Hortons later, but Arc'teryx, a Canadian brand that has been owned by a series of foreign private equity companies, most lately Anta from China, reported in 2021 that its China revenue is bigger than the rest of the world combined, at about 800 million Canadian dollars. And that would move Arc'teryx just above coal mining at number 10 on our export list. Next slide. And services are perhaps even more important than products. Education services were Canada's largest export to China in 2019, larger than any product. And Chinese students made up about a quarter of the international student body. They spent almost $6 billion in Canada, and they helped support 57,000 jobs. These activities are a key driver of the social and cultural connection between the two countries. Canadians feel very strongly about our values and our system. And education, even more so than tourism, is a great way to demonstrate what Canada is all about. Canadian universities are highly reliant on Chinese international students who generate higher than average revenue. In 2017, 39% of Chinese students chose commerce, whereas only 13% of other international students chose that major. Students also have a strong path to immigration, which is another contributor of economic growth. Next slide. Canada relies significantly on immigration to support an aging population. In the last decade, the GDP contribution of Chinese immigrants grew an average of 9% per year, while the overall Canadian GDP growth grew at only 1.5% in that same period. This is an amazing contribution, one that should be recognized, celebrated, and nurtured. Next slide. The second research project CCBC did in 2021 was our biannual business survey, and I have to say that most of the findings were pretty disappointing. Canadian companies are definitely losing ground to our American and European competitors. But there was a bright spot, and the most positive finding relates to the Canada brand. The branding of being a Canadian company in business development in China played some sort of role for 87% of respondents, and for 20% it plays a very major role. Just look at the success of Canada Goose. That's why we made the Canada brand a category in our Business Excellence Awards last year. Next slide. We began these awards in 2008 as a way to celebrate the success of organizations in Canada-China business. They are also a way to respond to the question, if companies are doing so well, how come we never hear about it? Granted, in this complex geopolitical environment, many companies are happy to keep their heads down. But for those willing to tell their stories, we provide a platform that can also show other companies that success is possible. Last year's winners include some well-known brands like Tim Hortons or Lululemon. Oh, and they all are showing up. Excellent. They include companies started by Canadians who moved to China, by Chinese who moved to Canada, and by Chinese companies that have invested in Canada for the long term, in some cases, to help increase Canada's exports to a willing consumer market in China, like Canada Royal Milk in Kingston. And it's not just products. Access Leisure Management has been building Canadian DNA into China's growing winter sports market, and Canada Wood promotes Canadian expertise and solutions for green building. Next slide. I'd like to also share some thoughts on Canada's new Indo-Pacific strategy. We're happy that it includes China, even if it takes a bit of a hard line. But the strategy acknowledges that China is a very important part of the Indo-Pacific market. And if you look at a pie chart of Canada's exports to the world, the US is most of the pie at 76% in 2021. Asia's slice is 11%. And if you then divide that slice among all the Asian countries, China and Hong Kong are nearly half at 5.2% of Canada's exports to the world. That doesn't sound like a lot, but South Korea, India, Taiwan, and Indonesia are each less than 0.5%. The strategy also stresses that the business community needs to be clear-eyed about the risks of doing business in China, and they need to be diversifying to other countries. Rest assured, Canadian business is well aware of China's risks and has been focused on diversification even without official exhortation to do so. But companies must follow their customers, and global customers are in China. Recently, I was told by a large client, if you can't supply me everywhere I do business, including China, I will have to find another supplier. Next slide. Another point that the Indo-Pacific strategy makes is that Canada will continue to protect Canadian market access in China. And market access is a big issue for many of our members. But business needs both governments to talk to each other to resolve issues of market access and fairness. When that doesn't happen, it can be felt from coast to coast. Let's take an example. Next slide. While consumption is growing, China's population is about to drop off a cliff. Actually, can we go back a slide? Let's go back one slide. There we go. And while the population is declining, people don't want to have kids, but they do want pets. So the pet industry is a happy place, as you can see from the growth chart on the right. It's estimated to still be in the double digits, around 13% this year. Next slide. Now, Canada's pet food industry exports to 90 countries, so they're already diversifying. But in 2021, China was our #2 export market, and growth was almost 22% a year between 2017 and 2021. Next slide. Since February last year, China has placed restrictions on Canadian pet food containing poultry due to avian flu outbreaks, refusing to acknowledge a globally recognized finding that pet food is safe due to its processing methods. In fact, the US has the same avian flu issues but has not had its exports restricted. And what that means is that in 2022, Canada lost more than 40% of its pet food exports due to these restrictions, while the US grew by more than 300%. And Canadian manufacturers have had to move production down to the US to continue shipping, which means job losses in rural communities in Canada. Next slide. For products like pet food, China's window of opportunity is wide open, and it still should be open to us. That's why we need to keep trading with China, because otherwise we lose ground to our American competitors. CCBC is working closely with the Pet Food Association of Canada, and we are hopeful that the situation will soon be resolved before Chinese cats and dogs develop a preference for American pet food. As you can see from this sector's example, companies are selling into many Indo-Pacific countries, but it's going to take a long time for those countries to grow to the size of China's pie slice. This is why, even though China is hard, it can be a very worthwhile market while the window is open, and while we wait for the windows in other markets to open wider. How can Canada keep growing its exports to China and keep up with our competitors while that window is open? It takes people. People who are willing to hop on a plane and develop business, to establish and nurture relationships, who understand what Canada is all about and can take the best of Canada to China. I would argue that it takes many of you in this room. Next slide. In terms of keeping things going, it is sectors that involve people that have the most potential. Keeping the flow of excellent students up, attracting tourists now that we can travel again, and ensuring that immigrants from China contribute more fully to Canada's success are all important. For example, we've talked about the big brands, but small Canadian brands can do very well in China. Take CCBC member Viva Naturals, a mid-sized supplement manufacturer that launched its first Tmall store in 2017. Using very modest marketing budgets and a talented immigrant to Canada from China, it has grown like crazy, as you can see from this chart. The company's China growth has spurred new co-manufacturing in Mexico, an expanded fish oil plant in Canada for growing demand, and doubling of its headquarters staff in Toronto. Next slide. Individuals have played such an important role in over 50 years of official relations between Canada and China. Individuals who had the forethought to establish relations early, who forged institutional and business ties and fought to demonstrate their country's values while developing relationships. People who valued the other country and its opportunities so much that they made their homes, lives, and careers in that other country. In 2020, on the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations, CCBC ran a 5 at 50 program to recognize people who have played a role in the relationship in 5 categories, and your organization had many members who contributed. I know that Grace Yu preceded Tony Luck as president of your association, so I hope she doesn't mind me highlighting her recognition as one of the finalists in that 5 at 50 program. Next slide. Let me finish by a comment made by the Honourable Jean Charest at our AGM last year. Despite the Canadian government's issues with China, he feels that engagement is the only option for Canada with China. You can't just stop and restart whenever you feel like it. And when the government isn't engaging sufficiently, the business community has to keep things going, and we have to persevere. We will. And the resolution of many issues on which our countries disagree will always come sooner with face-to-face contact and better mutual understanding. Thank you, and enjoy your evening.